Hold up.
What's up, beautiful people? Today we are taking a look at the budget. We're talking about money, loot, dinero, whatever you want to call it. So let's get started. So when we're talking about the budget, this includes where the government gets the money and on what it decides to spend the money on. A very important big idea to keep in mind, the implied and enumerated powers in the Constitution allow Congress to pass a federal budget, raise revenue, and coin money. So the Constitution gives tremendous power in this area to Congress. When we're talking about revenues, we're talking about the source of money. You could see on that graphic right there, kind of where federal revenue has come from. And if there's more revenue than expenditures, that's when you have a surplus. Speaking of expenditures, this is how money will be spent. And if there are more expenditures than revenues, that's when you have a deficit. And this is more often the case, especially in recent history, which leads to the government borrowing a lot of money. There's not enough money coming in, and so we've been running deficits quite frequently. Most revenue raised by the federal government is raised by taxes, and the number one source is from personal federal income taxes. Now, as you can see on the graphic, there are all sorts of different types of taxes the federal government collects, personal, corporate, so on, but the biggest source of income is from the personal income taxes. Now, this wasn't always the case because back in the day, there was no federal income tax. This was not originally spelled out in the Constitution. They did have excise taxes, which is a tax on a specific item such as whiskey, but there was no federal income tax until the 16th Amendment ratified in 1913, which allowed Congress to establish an income tax. This led to the creation of the IRS to collect and process tax revenues. Speaking of federal revenue, income tax, the federal income tax is progressive, and what that means is higher incomes are taxed at a higher rate. So people who make more money are going to be taxed at a higher percentage. And as you can see on the graphic, the more money you make, the higher percent you get taxed on your federal income taxes. There are some households that make such little money that they are not required to pay taxes. I think in like 2013, it was around 43% of households who filed didn't have to pay any federal income taxes. So it all depends on how much money you're bringing in. There are alternative models to a progressive tax. One famous one is the flat tax, and this is basically where everyone pays the same tax rate. It doesn't matter how much you make, there's a flat tax. Corporate taxes are also an important source of federal revenue, but while the percent corporations are supposed to pay may be high, oftentimes corporations find many ways to avoid paying taxes. You can see on the graphic just kind of the corporate tax percent has actually dipped in recent years. So corporations are really good at finding ways to avoid paying. You know, this is a global economy. They have foreign subsidiaries, foreign bank accounts, and so corporate tax rates may be one thing, but their actual payment may be another. Another source of revenue is social insurance taxes, and this is things like Social Security and Medicare taxes are withheld from an employee's paycheck. These taxes are paid in addition to income taxes and are used to pay for programs such as Social Security, and oftentimes they are matched by an employer through payroll taxes. So both the employee and the employer pay these social insurance taxes, especially when it comes to Social Security. Now, when we're talking about money, very often we need to talk about borrowing because the government borrows money when tax revenue does not reach the amount needed to cover federal expenditures. And as we mentioned, this has been the case very often in recent history. This gap between money needed and actual revenues make up a deficit. And there's all sorts of different ways the government can borrow. One way is when the Treasury Department sells bonds. This can happen and the government would pay interest to bondholders, or the government borrow money from itself, taking money from one government program such as Social Security to pay for something else. Regardless of the source, money borrowed by the federal government and the interest owed makes up the national debt. So not only do you have to pay the money back, but you have to pay that interest back as well. There was a brief period in the 90s where we had a surplus. There was no need to borrow any money, but we still owed money from previous borrowing. Congress does establish a debt ceiling, which limits how much loot the government can borrow. But when the US government starts to run out of money, Congress can vote to lift the debt ceiling, oftentimes at the request of the president, and then this allows the country to borrow more money. And oftentimes in this process, Congress will use the ability to raise the debt ceiling as a bargaining chip to try to get things out of the president. So there's this back and forth going on between Congress and the president when there's a need to raise the debt ceiling. An important trend to keep in mind is tax revenue decreases during economic downturn. And the main reason it will drop, tax revenues will drop, is because more people are out of work. Thus, they're not paying taxes on income because they ain't making any cheddar, any loot, any dinero. The problem is spending will often increase when revenue declines. More people need the help of the government, programs like unemployment, WIC, and all of these things that make up the safety net. So there's more of a demand for spending at the same time that revenue is actually dropping. Oftentimes during economic downturns, the government will spend money to try to stimulate the economy or bail out important industries. So during these periods of economic downturn, the debt will frequently increase. And you can see that debt ceiling and the national debt escalating ever since the 1980s. Talking about taxes and public policy, make sure you know about tax expenditures. This is a tax revenue that is lost as a result of exemptions. And what this means is it's basically money that the government could collect, but they don't because it is exempt from taxation. And there's lots of different things the government offers tax exemptions for. For example, taxpayers may deduct charitable contributions if you give money to your church or the Goodwill or so on, interest on your mortgage, or business deductions. All of these are things that households can deduct from their taxable income, thus allowing them to pay less tax. And you can see over there on the right, the top 10 largest individual tax expenditures. Tax exemptions typically tend to have a greater benefit to the wealthy and business interests. They have more things to write off, more things to get exemptions for. But nevertheless, things like deducting your mortgage interest, child tax credits, and others are very popular across the board. This one is pretty obvious, but important nonetheless. Tax cuts are very popular with voters. You could see famously George Bush Sr. saying to voters, "Read my lips, no new taxes." He had to break that promise, but they're a little bit more complicated than normally portrayed. Everybody wants more money on their paycheck. Tax reductions may do exactly that, but tax cuts typically cause increases in the deficit. And the reason being is government typically doesn't cut expenses, especially for popular government programs that may be expensive. Voters don't want those services cut, and so tax cuts have less revenue, which means the deficit's going up. The other thing to keep in mind about tax cuts is they also tend to favor the wealthy since they impact income, and wealthy people are making a heck of a lot more money than most folks are, and so they're going to get a lot more money back. When it comes to federal expenditures, we've said this, but it bears repeating. Federal government spending has steadily increased since the 1930s. The size of the federal government has increased as voters look to the government to do more things. One source of this increased spending has to do with defense spending, since it's substantially increased throughout the 20th century. You had World War I, World War II, Cold War, which had the Korean War, Vietnam, and of course the terrorist attacks on 9/11. All of that led to a huge increase in defense spending. But nonetheless, another source of increased government spending is the result of the New Deal in the 1930s and the Great Society in the 60s that led it to a dramatic increase in social programs, often called entitlements. And these entitlement programs are programs designed to provide benefits to people based upon a criteria set up by a law. FDR and Social Security was designed to reduce poverty amongst the elderly, LBJ's Medicare, health insurance for the elderly. These programs and many others have been expanded to provide benefits to more people. One challenge to these federal entitlements is the fact that there are more beneficiaries than workers. Money for programs such as Social Security is deducted from paychecks. Current workers are paying today's retirees. But the problem is, it's not really a problem, but the challenge is birth rates are declining and people are living longer. And funding these programs as people are living longer and there's less people paying in becomes challenging. Another thing to keep in mind is the cost of these programs can't be easily cut. This is mandatory spending required by law. So for example, lawmakers would have to change the age someone would be eligible to receive Social Security benefits, but they'd have to pass a law. And it's very unpopular for lawmakers to try to change these programs or the eligibility for these programs because there are a lot of voters who benefit from these benefits. So once again, tax cuts are popular, but oftentimes do not come with cuts to spending, and this creates problems and deficits and new challenges. Speaking of expenditures, most federal budgets experience incremental increases each year. Often when they're creating a budget, they start with what was spent in previous years, and usually slight increases in cash is given to various federal agencies. They adjust for inflation or new initiatives, but spending is just kind of oftentimes just slightly increased year to year. It's very rarely reduced. Exceptions would be if the president or Congress want to introduce some new initiative or there's some huge increase in federal defense spending, but oftentimes there's this idea of incrementalism in the budget process. A very important point to keep in mind is the idea that the federal spending is uncontrollable. Certain things are already in place and can't easily be changed. And this is the idea of uncontrollable expenditures. And what this means is about 2/3 of federal spending is automatic. We're talking about interest on the national debt, which you can see right here, federal entitlements such as Medicare, Social Security, veterans benefits. So these things are automatic, so Congress can't just reduce the spending without changes to law or without ignoring the federal debt and the interest that we have to pay on it. When it comes to federal entitlements, this is a huge chunk of the federal budget. It is the majority, and since everyone over 65 is eligible for Medicare, for example, and people are living longer and more people are eligible for other programs like Social Security, this puts further strains on the system. A very important big idea to keep in mind is Congress must generate a budget that addresses both discretionary and mandatory spending. And as entitlement costs grow, discretionary spending opportunities will decrease unless tax revenues increase or the budget deficit increases. And that's a mouthful, so let me explain this. Discretionary spending requires annual appropriations bills. Laws must be passed. And this type of spending, discretionary spending, is typically for a fixed time frame. Therefore, it is at the discretion of Congress. Mandatory spending is established by law and does not need an annual appropriations bill. And as we mentioned, mandatory spending is mostly the result of entitlement programs such as Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and so on. And we call these programs entitlements because individuals meeting the eligibility requirements set by past laws are entitled to federal government benefits or services. So what the heck does this big long sentence mean? Congress needs to pass a bill that deals with both these things, but entitlement costs are growing, people are living longer, and so there's less money for discretionary spending unless Congress is willing to increase taxes or change tax code or budget deficits increase. And so that is the big challenge. Further compounding these challenges is the fact that pork barrel legislation and log rolling affect lawmaking in both chambers. And pork barrel politics is spending which is intended to benefit constituents of a politician in return for their political support. So a congressperson will try to get a project that will bring in money or jobs or something into their district. They're bringing home the bacon, and in exchange, they'll oftentimes support another lawmaker's bill. And so very often you will see members of Congress slipping in funding for a local project, something that will benefit their district, into a larger appropriations bill, kind of, bringing home the bacon to the people. Now, this is bad because this can lead to wasteful spending. So people like it when it's done in their district by their congressperson, but they don't like it when spending is seemingly wasted in other districts where you get no benefit. The log rolling effect is an arrangement in which two or more members of Congress agree in advance to support each other's bill. And this is an informal pact between members to vote for each other's priorities, but this can also lead to increased spending that may or may not be needed. Finally, the budgetary process. And a shocking truth must be stated, the budgetary process is extremely political. And so I'm going to give you two versions, the way it's supposed to work and the way it oftentimes works now. Now, this process is very important. This decides where the money goes, when it goes. So the process is this: the president submits a budget. The Office of Management and Budget, OMB, as it's called on the streets, helps prepare the budget, gets it ready, and the president will approve it. And once the president approves the budget, it goes to Congress. Now, this is not the official budget because Congress has the power of the purse, but the president does, with the help of the OMB, prepare their budget. What then happens is the House and Senate each have the budget committees in their chambers develop their own budget proposals. Once they develop their own proposals, you have a budget resolution that is the compromise budget agreed by both chambers of Congress. Following the resolution, you have budget reconciliation, which involves changing any laws to make the numbers work. You might need to raise taxes to have the needed funds or change formulas for entitlement programs, and this gets done during the budget reconciliation phase. Then you have authorization bills, which establish or change government programs. And then finally, you have appropriation bills passed to fund the programs. Congress has to pass to fund the stuff established by the authorization bills. And Congress passes these bills and the president signs them. Now, throughout this process, there are various groups attempting to influence the process. Interest groups, government agencies, a whole bunch of people trying to get funds for their particular cause or interest. However, let me remind you of this shocking truth. The budgetary process is extremely political. So here is the process in real life. And it is a bummer because partisan bickering has prevented agreements from being reached on appropriations bills. Divided government, where the Democrats or the Republicans control one branch and the other party controls the others, have kind of stalled this process. Here's what's really going down lately. The president has proposed a budget and Congress just ignores it. Next, deadlines approach and a threat of a government shutdown becomes very real. You can see some of the government shut down since 1976. In order to get the government functioning again, Congress ends up passing continuing resolutions. What these continuing resolutions are laws that basically allow agencies to spend at last year's level. And the whole purpose of a continuing resolution is to get the government functioning again. And the president will typically sign these resolutions, but nothing is really resolved. The budget issues aren't really addressed, but the government does start back up again. Finally, understanding budgeting. As we've seen, increase in the size and scope of the federal government has led to increases in federal spending. Bigger government has led to bigger budgets. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are popular with voters, and there are fierce political debates about how to spend and raise money. And the politics of scarcity means that there are not enough funds to meet all of the demands placed on the government. And every year we face tough choices in the budget process. As a result, public policy is pulled in two directions. Voters want low taxes, but also want various services. We want preservation of nature, inspection of food, healthcare for the elderly, securing the border, food for low-income kids. Congressional leaders want to bring pork barrel projects to their states and districts. This helps them get reelected. But these things cost money, and oftentimes the tough choices of how to pay for them, or where to increase taxes, or where to lower taxes, or how to spend money more efficiently don't get made because, government. Hope you learned a whole bunch of stuff. Thank you for watching. Hope you have a beautiful day. Peace.